Have you ever planned a dream vacation only to have it slowly turn into a nightmare? I just wanted to hike with my beloved dog, enjoy a few days of peace. But my elderly parents, their stubbornness and unspoken expectations turned this trip into a painful lesson about family, responsibility, and exhaustion. This is the story of how my vacation was stolen from me and how I had to make the hardest decision of my life. I had been dreaming about this trip for months. Just me, my dog, and a trail somewhere far away, a place where the air was crisp, the paths winding through dense pine forests, and where the world felt just a little quieter. I had pictured it 100 times, strapping on my hiking boots, feeling the tension of the city melt away with each step, the dog happily trotting beside me, ears flopping, nose twitching at every scent. It seemed simple. It seemed perfect. But life, of course, had other plans. My parents, both in their 80s, had suddenly decided that they wanted to come along. My father, stubborn as ever, should really have been confined to a wheelchair, yet he insisted on being part of the plan. My mother, ever so cautious but still demanding in her way, tagged along with no real input but constant commentary on what should or shouldn't happen. Their energy or lack thereof was immediately draining. I remember the way my father leaned on his cane, giving me that hard look as if to say, "Don't even think of planning anything without us." And my mother, quietly hovering behind, with a frown that seemed permanently etched onto her face, muttering under her breath about this and that. I didn't want to upset them. God knows, after years of trying to please them, I had learned that a wrong word could turn into a week-long silent treatment, or worse, an argument over something completely trivial. And yet, even as I felt my excitement bubble up at the thought of hiking trails and fresh air, there was a sinking knot in my stomach. This wasn't going to be a simple adventure anymore. Weeks had passed since I first suggested the idea. I had mentioned casually to my parents that I wanted to take the dog to this national park. 8 hours away, the kind of place that welcomed dogs on trails. I was imagining long hikes, crisp morning air, an evening spent beside a small fire, reflecting quietly while the dog curled up at my feet. "We want to come too," my father had said immediately, the stubborn set of his jaw making it clear this wasn't a suggestion, it was a declaration. My mother nodded silently, her eyes unreadable, but I knew that her compliance always came with expectations I hadn't yet understood. I tried to be accommodating. I assured them it was fine, that their company would be welcome. But I had conditions in mind, just one day, maybe 2, to get out on the trails with my dog. That seemed reasonable. I was thinking about balance, compromise. I was thinking about peace, and then the world got busy. Work piled on, deadlines loomed, and for a fleeting moment, I considered postponing the trip entirely. Until my father, or rather, began the endless questioning. "When are we going?" he asked. "Are we leaving yet?" And so, with that gentle but relentless push, I realized the trip couldn't wait indefinitely. My parents weren't getting any younger, and the thought that this might be the last chance to share something together made me swallow the frustration rising in my chest. Planning for a vacation with 2 elderly parents is deceptively complex. For a trip with a dog, it would have been simple. But for parents who could barely climb stairs, who needed careful accommodations and constant monitoring, it was a logistical nightmare disguised as a family outing. I began looking for Airbnbs with ramps, accessible bathrooms, and tours that accommodated mobility issues. I downloaded apps to guide our self-driving excursions. I mapped routes that could be enjoyed from the car. I tried to anticipate every possible hiccup before it even arrived. And then there were the kids. My own children, nostalgic and eager, wanted to revisit places they had loved in their childhood. Suddenly, my perfectly imagined quiet hike became a moving caravan of needs. Elderly parents, nostalgic children, and a dog who didn't understand why walks were no longer about freedom but about carefully calculated stops and ramps. Even with all this planning, it became immediately obvious that hiking the very reason I had dreamed of this trip was going to be impossible. My parents had no interest in helping plan an activity for me. I was constantly calculating their comfort, their limits, their moods. And the dog, poor thing, stuck in the car for hours at a time. Panting and restless by the second day, frustration was already simmering beneath the surface. Simple tasks, like getting the TV to work in the Airbnb, became mine to manage. I found myself driving to stores, running errands, troubleshooting issues that were never my responsibility to begin with. The trip that had been supposed to be rejuvenating was slowly transforming into a week-long exercise in endurance. Every glance at my father reminded me of the stubbornness that had shaped him. Every sigh from my mother reinforced the sense that nothing could ever be simple. And as the days stretched on, the dream of that first morning on the trail, the crisp air, and the dog bounding ahead seemed further and further away. I kept telling myself, just a little longer. We'll make it through. Maybe tomorrow. But deep down, I knew the balance was off. My vacation had already begun to unravel, tangled in the needs of everyone else. And I was just left with the hollow realization: this trip, the one I had dreamed about for months, might never be mine. Asterisk. The morning we finally left, I felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. The car was packed, luggage for all of us, food for the road, my meticulously prepared backpack for hiking, and, of course, the dog's favorite blanket and toys. The dog was bouncing around, tail wagging uncontrollably, sensing the adventure ahead, or maybe just sensing the energy of a car ride, which he had always loved. My parents climbed into the car with careful precision, my father insisting on managing his own wheelchair, grunted at every step, muttering complaints about whether the seatbelt was comfortable enough and whether the air conditioning was set just right. My mother quietly fussed with the placement of her pillow, making adjustments I didn't ask for but couldn't refuse. It was immediately clear that nothing about this trip was going to go smoothly. The first few hours were manageable. We drove, the highway stretching endlessly ahead, sunlight spilling through the windows. I had programmed the GPS to take us through scenic routes where the dog could safely get a few breaks. My parents occasionally commented, half-heartedly, on the passing landscapes, while my children pointed excitedly at landmarks they remembered from years ago. For a moment, the world felt almost normal, almost like the vacation I had imagined. Then reality began its slow unraveling. Every stop became a negotiation. My father's wheelchair needed careful handling, and every small incline felt like a monumental task. My mother complained about the seating arrangements, the temperature, the radio station, even the dog's excited yips. Every minor inconvenience: doors that didn't close smoothly, a rest area too crowded. A trail too uneven became a debate, a moral battle over what was safe or appropriate. I tried to stay patient. I reminded myself that they were old, that mobility was difficult, that every complaint was rooted in fear or habit. But as the hours wore on, the frustration bubbled beneath my calm exterior. The dog, once full of energy, was now restless, pawing at the car door, whining at the stop-and-go motion. The children were growing impatient, repeatedly asking when we could get out and explore, their voices tinged with nostalgia but also irritation. I realized then that the vision I had nurtured for months, the crisp morning air, the quiet trail, the dog bounding ahead, was slipping away. Minute by minute, compromise by compromise. Every decision I made, every small adjustment, felt like a step away from what I truly wanted. The accommodations I had carefully arranged, a wheelchair-friendly Airbnb, tours that welcomed mobility limitations, were helpful in theory, but in practice, they highlighted the gap between expectation and reality. My father refused to participate in anything that required even the slightest exertion. My mother seemed to exist only to observe, to comment, to make sure that I was constantly adjusting to their needs. I could feel my own desires being pushed aside, shoved into the background by their rigid expectations. By the second day, the fatigue was noticeable, just physical, but mental, emotional. I found myself constantly scanning for potential problems. Was the dog comfortable? Were my children entertained? Was my father safe? Was my mother's back supported enough? Every decision became a calculation, every stop a negotiation, every small action an act of diplomacy. Meals were another battleground. Eating out was nearly impossible. Menus too complicated, chairs too high, tables too cramped. I ended up improvising constantly, running errands just to satisfy the most basic needs. I hadn't anticipated this level of mental labor, this constant vigilance. And yet, every time I tried to voice my own small desires, short walk, a moment of peace, even just a cup of coffee in silence, I was met with indifference, or worse, mild reproach. The dog, sensing my stress, would nuzzle against my leg at every pause, as if reminding me that he too wanted the adventure we had planned together. I felt a pang of guilt. My carefully imagined hike, the moment I had looked forward to for months, was vanishing in a haze of errands, complaints, and constant adjustments as the afternoon sun dipped low. I drove us to another scenic spot my children wanted to see. My parents remained in the car, wheels locked in place, quietly observing. I watched them settle into their seats, and I felt a mix of frustration and sorrow. This wasn't a family vacation. This was a series of compromises, one after another, where my desires, the very reason I had planned this trip, were the first casualties. I remembered the first morning's excitement, the way I had imagined stepping out onto the trails, the dog bounding ahead, the quiet beauty of untouched nature. And now, that vision felt like a distant memory. Every mile we drove, every trail we bypassed, every stop we took only reinforced the fact that I had sacrificed my dream to accommodate others. By evening, the mental exhaustion was crushing. Even simple tasks, setting up the Airbnb, making sure the TV worked, preparing dinner, felt monumental. My father grumbled about something minor. My mother made a subtle complaint about the air conditioning, and I felt my patience fraying. The dog finally allowed a brief walk, sniffed the ground as though sensing the tension in the air. I went to bed that night with a knot in my stomach. I had expected a vacation filled with laughter, freedom, and simple pleasures. Instead, I was exhausted, my dreams postponed indefinitely, trapped in a cycle of caregiving and compromise. And yet, deep down, I knew that pulling out now would feel like failure, like abandoning my parents at the very moment they needed me most. It was in that quiet, restless night listening to the faint snoring of the dog curled at my feet, that I realized this vacation was no longer about hiking trails or fresh air. It was about endurance, about negotiation, about managing expectations that weren't mine to manage. And it was about understanding, in a visceral way, how dreams could be deferred in the name of family, love, and obligation. The third day arrived like a slow, creeping storm. At first, the morning seemed calm, the sun was pale but promising. The dog wagged his tail as I packed our things into the car, and my children chattered about places they wanted to revisit. But beneath that fragile calm, tension simmered, unseen but undeniable. Every minor detail felt amplified. My father complained about the seatbelt, the angle of the wheelchair, whether the road ahead was bumpy enough to make the ride uncomfortable. My mother, silently judging, occasionally reminded me that we had to be careful and not rush things. Her words were soft, polite, but there was an edge that made my stomach tighten. Even the dog seemed aware, pressing close to my leg, as if sensing the invisible storm brewing. By mid-morning, the first cracks began to show. My father refused to participate in any activity that required walking or even standing for a few minutes. Trails that I had hoped we could explore were abandoned before we even arrived. The dog, full of energy, bounced impatiently at every stop, sniffing the ground, whining to be let out. His excitement clashing violently with my father's immobility. I found myself constantly scanning for solutions. Should we try a different trail? A shorter route? A place where my father could observe without leaving the car? Every decision required careful calculation, balancing their needs against mine and against the dog's desire to move freely. My children, despite their enthusiasm, grew restless, tugging at my sleeve and asking why we couldn't just explore like we used to. It was exhausting, mentally exhausting, emotionally exhausting. I had imagined a few days of peaceful walking, of quiet contemplation along forest trails. Instead, I was navigating a labyrinth of complaints, mobility issues, and constant adjustments. The dream I had held in my mind, the cool morning air, the scent of pine needles. The dog running ahead of me was slipping further away with every mile. Meals became a battlefield. Finding a restaurant that could accommodate my father's wheelchair, my mother's cautious requirements, and the kids' nostalgia was nearly impossible. I improvised constantly, rearranging tables, carrying plates, managing utensils, and calming frustrations before they escalated. At every turn, I had to remind myself to stay patient, to stay calm. I reminded myself that they were old, that they couldn't help their stubbornness, that they weren't intentionally trying to ruin the trip. But patience has its limits. By the afternoon, I could feel the tension coiling inside me, like a spring about to snap. My father muttered incessantly about discomfort. My mother offered gentle but unrelenting criticism, and even the dog seemed aware of my simmering frustration, pawing at my knee, whining softly. I realized that this was no longer a vacation, it was an endurance test. A test of my patience, my ability to manage not just the logistics of travel, but the heavy weight of expectations that were neither fair nor reasonable. The landscape I had longed for, the open trails, the gentle slope of hills, the quiet beauty of untouched nature, was always just out of reach. Every attempt to get a few minutes of walking, a simple hike, or even a break in the open air, was blocked by logistics, physical limitations, or subtle resistance. The dog, my constant companion and the one being who seemed to understand my need for freedom, became increasingly restless. I felt his frustration mirrored my own, a silent reminder of what we had both been denied, in quiet moments. When I thought no one was watching, I reflected on how absurd this all felt. I had planned, researched, and imagined every detail for months, preparing for obstacles and trying to ensure that everyone else would be comfortable. And yet, the harder I tried, the more impossible the dream seemed. Every adjustment I made for my parents came at the cost of my own desires. Every compromise for the sake of harmony pushed my personal happiness further into the shadows. By the late afternoon, the emotional weight became nearly unbearable. I was driving along winding roads, the dog panting softly in the back, my children silent, for once, perhaps sensing my mood. My parents were quiet too, but I could feel the unspoken pressure, the subtle reminders that they were the reason for this trip, that every inconvenience was mine to manage. I realized then that the trip I had imagined freedom, adventure, simple joy with my dog was gone. It had been replaced by an endless cycle of adjustments, compromises, and unseen resentments. And yet, despite all of this, leaving wasn't an option yet. Not when my parents depended on me, not when my children still looked to me to make the day happen. And so I drove on. Each mile a quiet testament to endurance. Each glance at the dog, restless but loyal, reminded me of what had motivated this trip in the first place. Each sigh from my father and each soft critique from my mother tightened the coil of frustration in my chest. I knew that the breaking point was near, but I also knew that I couldn't yet let go. Not yet by nightfall, as I helped everyone settle into the Airbnb place I had carefully chosen for accessibility and convenience. The exhaustion hit fully. I collapsed into a chair, rubbing my temples, listening to the faint snoring of the dog curled at my feet. My children had retreated to their rooms, and my parents quietly arranged themselves in their own corners. The silence was temporary, a fragile truce, and I realized, lying there in that meticulously prepared room, that this trip, this supposed dream vacation, had already revealed its truth. It wasn't a vacation. It was a lesson in patience, endurance, and the quiet, relentless demands of family. I didn't yet know how far I would be pushed, how soon the breaking point would come, or what decisions I would have to make to reclaim even a fraction of the freedom I had imagined. But I knew this by the fourth day. The trip I had dreamed about would either be my undoing, or the moment I finally chose myself. The fourth day started with the same sense of quiet dread that had been growing like an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that today would be different, that maybe we could salvage a fragment of what I had imagined for so long. But the moment I stepped into the car, reality slammed into me like a freight train. My father's wheelchair, which I had painstakingly folded and loaded the night before, became a point of tension immediately. "Is it locked properly?" he barked, his voice sharp and insistent. "I don't want any accidents." My mother added her own commentary, soft but relentless, about the air conditioning, the road, and whether the stops were frequent enough for comfort. I bit back a sigh, my knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. Every morning since we left, I had endured this ritual, every detail, every minor complaint, every suggestion or objection, a slow erosion of my patience. And yet, until now, I had managed to keep my composure, telling myself that it was for their safety, their comfort, for the sake of family. But by day 4, the veneer of calm had cracked. The dog, sensing my tension, whined incessantly in the back seat. Jumping onto the folded blanket I had laid out for him, my children fidgeted, restless from the lack of adventure, their excited chatter replaced by muted frustration. And there I was, the supposed leader of this expedition, feeling more like a servant chained to a schedule that belonged entirely to everyone else. The last straw came at the scenic overlook I had so carefully chosen, hoping it might provide at least a moment of peace. My parents refused to leave the car. My father grumbled that the ramp looked too steep. My mother whispered something about a draft making her uncomfortable. The dog, longing to explore the trails, paced in agitation, its soft whines echoing the frustration building in my chest. I realized then, with a clarity that cut through the fog of exhaustion, that this trip, the one I had meticulously planned and dreamed about, was no longer mine. Every adjustment I had made, every compromise I had endured, every ounce of patience I had mustered, had been spent trying to please everyone else. And for what? The vision I had held for months, the crisp morning air, the trail winding through the forest, the dog running ahead with pure joy, was gone. I slammed the car door and took a deep breath, feeling my heartbeat thunder in my ears. Enough, I muttered under my breath. The word tasted like liberation and guilt all at once. Enough of bending, enough of accommodating, enough of being the only one sacrificing. I didn't need permission. I didn't need approval. I needed to reclaim even a fragment of what this trip had been meant to be. I turned to my parents, my voice steady but firm. "We're going home," I said. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My father's eyes widened, a flash of anger crossing his face. "What do you mean, going home?" he demanded, voice rising. My mother's frown deepened, lips pressed tight, as if she were holding back a lecture she had been preparing for years. "I mean exactly what I said," I replied. "This trip isn't working. I've tried. I've bent over backwards for everyone, and it's gone too far. We're leaving." The car erupted in tension. My father accused me of having a bad attitude. My mother said I was being ungrateful, reminding me, in a tone meant to wound, that they had sacrificed for me my whole life. They were referencing my childhood, my upbringing, the countless times they had coddled or guided me, and, in that moment, it felt like a cruel twist. All their past generosity was being wielded as a weapon to guilt me into submission. I felt a pang of sorrow, mixed with anger and relief. I had loved them, respected them, done my best to honor their needs, but their expectations had become impossible. The vacation I had envisioned had been stripped away, replaced by a relentless treadmill of complaints, adjustments, and unmet needs. And finally, I recognized a truth I had been avoiding. Sometimes love requires boundaries. Sometimes survivally, emotional, mental, and even physical demands, making a choice that others will never understand. I began packing our things, calmly but deliberately. My children watched silently, a mixture of confusion and relief on their faces. The dog followed my movements, tail wagging faintly, as if he sensed that this was finally a turning point. I loaded the car efficiently, each motion a quiet declaration that this time I was choosing myself. The drive home was heavy with unspoken words. My parents remained mostly silent, the anger simmering beneath the surface. I focused on the road, the dog occasionally resting his head on my lap. The children's chatter slowly returning to normal as they realized we were heading toward familiar comfort that night. Back in my own home, I sat quietly, the dog curled at my feet, and reflected on what had just transpired. I felt a mixture of guilt, relief, sadness, and clarity. I had loved them, Yes, but in trying to protect their comfort, I had allowed my own dreams to be pushed aside. And in choosing to end the trip early, I had finally acknowledged that my own needs mattered. To Dot, it was not a triumphant moment, not in the traditional sense. There were no celebrations, no sense of victory. But there was honesty. There was acknowledgement. There was the quiet, profound understanding that boundaries are not betrayal, that self-care is not selfishness, and that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that preserve the very essence of who you are. For the first time in days, I felt a measure of peace. The trip had not been the adventure I had imagined, but it had taught me something far more enduring: the necessity of balance, the courage to assert your needs, and the bittersweet complexity of loving others while loving yourself. The drive home felt heavier than the trip itself. The car was quiet, too quiet. My children stared out the window, their faces a mix of confusion and lingering disappointment. The dog, sensing the tension, rested his head on my lap, eyes soft, almost apologetic. I wondered if even he felt the weight of the day, or if it was only me. Carrying the burden of choices no one else seemed willing to understand. My parents, of course, were not silent. My father muttered under his breath, comments sharp but restrained, a simmering anger that filled the car without needing words. My mother sighed repeatedly, shaking her head as if the act alone could undo the events of the past 4 days. "You could have handled that differently," she said at one point, her voice low but cutting. "We've always supported you, and you," she paused, searching for words that might sting the deepest. "You just decided to abandon us." I gritted my teeth. I had anticipated this, yes, but anticipation didn't dull the edge of hearing it out loud. "I didn't abandon you," I replied quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just realized this trip wasn't working. I can't be responsible for everyone's happiness while mine is completely erased. That's not fair to anyone." The silence that followed was tense, almost brittle, like the air itself was holding its breath. My father's hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white. I could see the tight coil of anger in his jaw. My mother turned her gaze toward the window, eyes distant, lips pressed together, and I sat there, feeling the weight of their disappointment, their expectations, yet also feeling an unfamiliar sense of liberation. Back home, the ritual of unpacking and settling in was almost cathartic. I placed the dog's blanket in its usual spot, letting him stretch out comfortably. My children helped with the luggage, still quiet but noticeably lighter in mood, and I began to breathe again. The tension slowly unwinding from my shoulders, but the emotional weight didn't lift entirely. That night, as I lay awake, I reflected on the events of the trip. I thought about the trails I had dreamed of hiking, the crisp air, the freedom I had envisioned. And I realized that freedom had been postponed, yes, but it wasn't lost forever. It had simply been deferred, delayed by circumstance, by love, and by responsibility. I thought about my parents, too. They were stubborn, yes, but not cruel. They were navigating their own limitations, their fears, and their need to feel included in something they couldn't fully participate in. And yet, their presence had made the trip a crucible for my patience and endurance. It was no longer just a vacation. It was a mirror reflecting the delicate balance between care for others and care for oneself. The following morning, I sat down with my parents, trying to break the tension with calm words. "I know this trip didn't go as anyone expected," I began, voice steady, "and I know you're upset. But we need to acknowledge something important. Everyone's needs matter. I tried to plan this for all of us, but it became impossible to satisfy everyone without sacrificing something vital, myself included. My father looked at me, eyes narrowing, skeptical but not dismissive. My mother's lips tightened, but there was a softness in her gaze, a glimmer of understanding hidden beneath layers of pride. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even acknowledgement entirely, but it was the first thread of connection after days of tension. In those quiet moments, I reflected further on the lessons learned. I thought about boundaries, about responsibility, about the delicate act of balancing love with self-preservation. It was not easy. It was not glamorous. But it was necessary. And I realized that, in the end, the trip had served a purpose I hadn't anticipated. It had forced me to confront the reality of caring for aging parents while maintaining my own sense of self. It had reminded me that love is not only about sacrifice, but also about honesty and courage. And it had reminded me, most of all, that my dreams, though sometimes postponed, still mattered. The days after the trip were heavy with tension that refused to dissipate. At first I thought returning home would bring relief, but instead I found the echoes of the vacation following me like shadows. My parents' subtle criticisms lingered, their disappointed glances cutting sharper than any words. Every conversation seemed to circle back to how I had handled the trip, a judgment I could not escape. My attitude was wrong, my father muttered one morning over breakfast, stirring his coffee with a deliberate slowness. You didn't even try to consider how we felt. His voice was calm, but the edge underneath was unmistakable. My mother nodded in agreement, her lips pursed, eyes fixed somewhere far away, as if she were rehearsing a lecture I would soon hear. I felt the familiar coil of frustration tighten in my chest. I had expected some fallout, yes, but the intensity was overwhelming. Every small comment, every passing remark, felt like another layer of accusation. I wanted to explain, to plead, to show them the careful planning, the thought, the constant consideration I had poured into the trip. At words seemed useless. Their minds were already made up. Even the children, though innocent in comparison, became a mirror reflecting my stress. They asked questions about the trip. We hadn't done certain things. Why the dog had been stuck in the car. Why I seemed so tense. I found myself snapping, a sharpness I immediately regretted, realizing that I was short with them not out of malice, but out of sheer exhaustion. The dog, sensing my emotional state, stayed close. His quiet presence, a comforting but also accusatory reminder that I had failed to give him the adventure he deserved. Each bark or whine seemed amplified in the silent house, a small chorus of frustration echoing my own inner turmoil. One afternoon, my father asked me why I hadn't forced the trip to be more enjoyable for everyone. "You're always thinking about yourself," he said, almost casually, as if these words carried no weight. But they did. They cut through the thin veneer of patience I had been maintaining, exposing the raw nerves underneath. My mother, too, began revisiting the past in subtle ways. "We always supported you," she reminded me, her voice calm yet accusatory, "and now you can't even support us for a few days." Her words carried the weight of decades, a reminder of childhood, of obligations, of unspoken debts I supposedly owed. I felt trapped between love and resentment, obligation and self-preservation. The more I tried to justify my choices, the more their judgment seemed to tighten around me like an invisible vice. It was exhausting, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Every attempt at conversation became a negotiation. Every minor action scrutinized, every decision questioned. Even mundane moments became battlegrounds. Setting the table for dinner, carrying groceries, walking the dog around the yard, each task was layered with silent expectation, subtle criticism, and the knowledge that nothing I did would ever be enough. My sense of agency, the very thing that had driven me to plan the vacation in the first place, felt eroded, diminished with every passing hour. And yet, amidst all this, I recognized a painful truth. I had choices. The frustration, the anger, the exhaustion were symptoms, yes, but they were also signals. Signals that my boundaries had been crossed, that my needs had been ignored for too long, that my patience had limits. I began to consider small acts of rebellion, quiet assertions of self-preservation. I would take the dog for long walks when my parents weren't looking, carve out moments of peace in corners of the house, and refuse to engage in arguments that led nowhere. It wasn't dramatic or heroic, it was survival, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension began to shift. My parents noticed, of course, the subtle resistance, the refusal to be entirely available at their convenience, sparked irritation. But it also created space for me to reclaim fragments of autonomy, to begin to breathe without constantly calculating their comfort. The lessons of the vacation lingered. Every minor conflict, every sharp word, every pang of guilt or resentment became part of a larger understanding. Family is complex, love is demanding, and sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that protect the self as much as the relationships we hold dear. By the end of the week, the air in the house felt lighter, not entirely, but enough to signal that change had begun. I wasn't fully at peace, but I had begun to assert myself, to prioritize my needs alongside theirs, and to accept that love sometimes required firm boundaries, even at the cost of temporary discomfort or disapproval. The tension that had been simmering for days finally erupted one evening. We were gathered in the living room, the dog curled up on the rug, the children quietly playing nearby, and my parents sitting across from me, expressions tight and expectant. I could feel the weight of unspoken grievances pressing down on me like a physical force. "You've been selfish," my father said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "You didn't think about us once during the trip. Not even a little." My mother nodded, a subtle confirmation, her eyes narrowing. "After everything we've done for you, you just put yourself first. That's how you repay us." Something inside me snapped. The restraint I had maintained, the careful patience, the constant self-denial of it exploded in a rush of heat and adrenaline. I stood, pacing the room, hands gripping my head for a moment as I tried to steady my voice. "I'm done feeling guilty for having needs of my own," I shouted, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and exhaustion. "I planned this trip. I tried to accommodate everyone. I bent over backwards for months, and I lost the one thing I wanted. The hike, the dog, the peace I imagined. And now I'm supposed to just swallow all that and pretend it's fine." My father's face turned red, and my mother's hands tightened in her lap, but I couldn't stop. I had rehearsed these words in my head for days, and now they poured out, raw and unfiltered. "I love you both," I continued, voice cracking slightly, "but love isn't just about sacrifice. It's not just about catering to your every need while ignoring my own. I can't do it anymore. I won't do it anymore. I have boundaries. I have limits. And I have a right to live my life too." The room was silent for a moment. The children looked up at me, wide-eyed, sensing the emotional intensity but unsure of what it meant. The The dog lifted his head, ears perked, as if aware that something significant was happening. My father's voice was low, almost strangled, as he spoke. "You're ungrateful. That's what you are. After everything we did for you." "I'm not ungrateful," I interrupted, firmly but with a new clarity. "I am exhausted. I am human, and I will not let my life, my dreams, my moments of happiness be dictated by fear or stubbornness or the past. You've raised me, yes, but you do not get to control me forever. And this ends now." The emotional release left me shaking, but also lighter, as though a heavy weight had been lifted from my shoulders. My parents sat in stunned silence, perhaps realizing for the first time the depth of my frustration, the extent of my compromise, and the cost of their expectations. After a long pause, my mother finally spoke, voice quieter now, tinged with something like understanding or maybe just resignation. "We didn't realize how much this affected you," she admitted. "We just wanted to be included. We didn't mean to make you suffer." My father remained silent, but the hard edge in his eyes softened slightly. The confrontation hadn't erased anger, hadn't dissolved years of habit or pride, but it had opened a door, a chance to start a dialogue, a space for honesty that had been missing for too long. I sank into the sofa, exhausted but resolute. The dog rested his head on my knee, and my children returned to their play, sensing that a storm had passed. And in that quiet moment, I realized that conflict, though painful, was sometimes necessary. Sometimes love required confrontation, and boundaries had to be drawn, even if it meant temporary discomfort. By the end of the evening, a fragile sense of peace returned. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete, but it was real. And that, I decided, was enough for now. Enough to start rebuilding, enough to reclaim parts of myself I had neglected for too long. The morning after our confrontation, the house was quieter than usual. The air felt lighter, though still tinged with the remnants of tension. I could sense that my parents were processing what had happened, just as I had spent the night reflecting on my own feelings and reactions. Breakfast was a cautious affair. My father stirred his coffee slowly, avoiding direct eye contact, while my mother arranged the plates with deliberate care, her movements careful and measured. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that the goal wasn't to win or to force. Apologize it was to begin a path toward understanding and balance. "I know things got heated last night," I began, voice calm. "I just want us to acknowledge something important. I love you both, and I want us to have a relationship built on honesty, not just obligation or guilt. We can't keep repeating the same patterns." My mother's hands froze for a moment. We just didn't realize," she said quietly, eyes softening. "We didn't mean to push you to the point of breaking." My father, after a long pause, nodded slightly. "We may not like it, but we understand," he admitted. His voice lacked its usual sharpness, and I sensed a subtle shift in opening for dialogue, even if tentative. The dog, sensing the shift in energy, hopped onto the couch beside me, resting his head on my lap. My children, observing from the corner, seemed lighter, as if the emotional weight of the previous days had begun to lift. It was a small but meaningful sign. The storm had passed, and though the clouds remained, there was space for clarity and connection. Throughout the day, we moved slowly, carefully, and intentionally. I took moments to walk the dog, allowing him to explore the yard freely while I breathed in the crisp air, reclaiming some of the personal freedom I had been denied. My parents observed quietly, occasionally asking questions about the neighborhood or the dog's behavior, but without criticism or complaint. It wasn't perfect. Old habits die hard, and I knew there would be moments of friction in the future. But for the first time, I felt that our family could navigate conflict without erasing each other's needs. There was mutual recognition. My parents saw that their expectations had limits, and I saw that my love and patience had boundaries that deserved respect. By evening, I reflected on the lessons learned. The trip, chaotic and frustrating, had revealed truths about patience, resilience, and the necessity of boundaries. It had reminded me that love and care are not measured solely by sacrifice, but also by honesty, courage, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable realities. I sat quietly, watching the dog curl up at my feet, feeling my children's laughter echo from the living room, and thought about my parents, their stubbornness, and their humanity. Life with them would always involve compromise, negotiation, and occasional frustration, but it would also contain moments of connection, understanding, and even joy. And in that quiet reflection, I realized something fundamental. Boundaries and empathy are not mutually exclusive. Loving others does not require losing oneself. Sacrifices are part of relationships, yes, but so is the courage to assert your own needs. In navigating this delicate balance, we discover what it truly means to care, to endure, and to live fully, even amidst the complexity of family life. The day ended not with dramatic gestures or grand reconciliations, but with a quiet, fragile peace. And I understood, finally, that this was a victory of a different kind, not the victory of having everything go perfectly, but the victory of surviving, learning, and beginning anew with honesty and integrity. The days following our tense confrontation were quiet, but the silence was different this time. It was not heavy with unspoken grievances. It carried the weight of reflection and the subtle tension of newfound understanding. I spent mornings walking the dog in the crisp air, feeling the freedom of movement, the joy of the trail, even if it was just around the neighborhood. Each step was a reminder that balance between personal desires and family obligations was possible, but only if I approached it thoughtfully. I began thinking about the trip itself, the carefully planned hikes, the wheelchair-accessible Airbnb, the tours for my parents. In theory, everything was perfect. In practice, the execution had failed because I had tried to mold the vacation to everyone at once, ignoring the reality that some needs were mutually exclusive. It was a hard lesson. Preparation alone cannot guarantee harmony when expectations clash. I considered the dog, my constant companion, and how restless he had been. His energy, his enthusiasm, mirrored what I had been longing for, a sense of adventure, unrestrained by compromise. And I realized that part of reclaiming my happiness meant acknowledging that some moments would have to prioritize my own experiences, even if it meant negotiating with others. I sat down with my parents later that week, in a calm and neutral space, to revisit the conversation with a different tone. "I've been thinking," I began, "about how this trip went, and what we can do differently next time. I want us all to enjoy ourselves, but I also want to make sure that I don't lose myself in the process." My mother listened quietly, nodding, while my father leaned back, skeptical but attentive. "I understand," my mother said slowly. "It's not easy for us either, but maybe we need to be more realistic." I suggested a new approach, splitting activities based on ability and interest, designing portions of the vacation where everyone could participate safely and meaningfully. and carving out pockets of time where I could engage in activities I truly wanted, like the hike I had dreamed of. We discussed compromises, short, guided walks for my parents, dog-friendly hikes for me, and shared family outings where we could all be together without forcing anyone into discomfort. For the first time since planning the original trip, I felt hopeful. There was a plan that respected my parents' limitations, my children's desires, the dog's needs, and crucially, my own. I realized that vacations, like relationships, require flexibility, honesty, and courage to assert boundaries. It wasn't about control or stubbornness. It was about creating a structure where everyone's experience could coexist without erasing the individual. That evening, I took the dog for another long walk, reflecting on what I had learned. The past trip, despite its chaos and frustration, had taught me the importance of communication, planning with empathy, and most importantly, valuing my own needs as much as those of others. It was not failure, it was preparation for success. The dog bounded ahead, sniffing the trail with unrestrained joy, and I followed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The balance between family care and personal fulfillment felt achievable, not idealized, but grounded in reality. And as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the path, I knew that the next vacation, planned thoughtfully, honestly, and with boundaries, could finally become the adventure I had dreamed of. The next vacation arrived with cautious optimism. This time I had a blueprint, a carefully constructed plan that accounted for everyone's needs, my parents' limitations, my children's desires, the dog's energy, and most importantly, my own need for freedom. I felt a strange mix of excitement and apprehension, aware that past experiences had left emotional scars I could not ignore. From the moment we arrived, the difference was palpable. The Airbnb was the same as before, wheelchair accessible, spacious, and dog-friendly, but this time, we approached it with clear expectations. My parents were informed that some days would involve only partial participation. My children understood that not every activity would cater to them, and I set aside deliberate windows for hikes, walks, and quiet time with the dog. The first morning, I took the dog on a long trail through a nearby park. The crisp air filled my lungs, the crunch of leaves underfoot was music to my ears, and the dog bounded ahead, tail high, completely unrestrained. For the first time in years, I felt that sense of adventure that had been missing from our previous trip. I returned refreshed, invigorated, and ready to engage with my family on their terms, without resentment or frustration. During the day, my parents participated in shorter, guided walks, led by tourist assistants who specialized in accessibility. Their laughter, cautious but genuine, reminded me that enjoyment wasn't about pushing limits, it was about finding joy within constraints. My children explored familiar landmarks, revisiting old memories, while understanding that this vacation required patience and compromise. There were moments of tension, of course. My father would occasionally grumble about moving too slowly or about the artificial nature of the guided walks. My mother sometimes fretted about schedules and accommodations, but this time I didn't absorb their frustration. I listened, acknowledged, and gently redirected when necessary. Boundaries had been set, and the difference was clear. Their resistance could exist without consuming my peace. Meal times became smoother. We had agreed in advance which restaurants could accommodate everyone comfortably, and the children learned to adapt to the pace required for my parents. I found myself laughing at small mishaps, rather than letting them trigger irritation. Even the dog seemed calmer, sensing the rhythm and structure that allowed him both freedom and security each evening. I reflected on the day's successes and challenges. The plan wasn't perfect. No vacation ever is. But for the first time, I experienced the balance I had been seeking: time for myself, meaningful engagement with my parents, quality moments with my children, and enough freedom for the dog to roam. It was a delicate choreography, but one grounded in empathy, communication, and mutual respect. By the fourth day, a sense of harmony emerged. My parents were relaxed, my children engaged, and the dog's enthusiasm was infectious. I realized that the chaos of the previous trip had not been in vain. It had taught us all, painfully but effectively, how to navigate the complexities of family dynamics while honoring personal needs as the sun set, casting warm golden light across the trail we had walked that morning. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The trip, redesigned and implemented thoughtfully, had become more than a vacation. It was a lesson in resilience, empathy, and the power of setting boundaries. I had reclaimed what I had lost, not through confrontation alone, but through careful planning, honest communication, and courage. And as I watched my family interact, laughing, sharing, and exploring in ways that accommodated everyone, I understood the profound truth of this experience. Vacations, like life, are not about perfection. They are about finding equilibrium, embracing imperfection, and ensuring that every voice, every need is acknowledged, even amidst compromise. By the fifth day of the redesigned vacation, something remarkable had begun to unfold. The rhythm we had worked so hard to establish was starting to feel natural. The mornings began with calm, my parents enjoying coffee on the balcony, my children planning small adventures together, and the dog exploring the yard with boundless energy. And I, for the first time in years, felt a genuine sense of presence and peace. We decided to visit a trail I had longed to hike, carefully chosen so that my parents could watch comfortably from the beginning point while I and the dog ventured along the winding path. The leaves crunched underfoot, birds sang in the distance, and the crisp mountain air filled me with a sense of exhilaration I hadn't experienced since childhood. The dog ran ahead, tail wagging furiously, turning back occasionally to check that I was following. It was the pure, unfiltered joy I had imagined months ago, returning to the base. My parents smiled, genuine warmth in their eyes. "You look happy," my mother said softly. "We can see it in you." My father nodded, a rare expression of pride and acknowledgement passing over his features. "It's good," he admitted, voice rough but sincere. "We're glad you're enjoying yourself." For a moment, I let myself absorb at their recognition, their understanding, their willingness to honor the boundaries I had set. I realized that the confrontation, the arguments, and the tension from the previous trip had been necessary for this moment. They had forced honesty and clarity, and now, slowly, the bonds of respect were knitting themselves stronger than ever. We spent the afternoon exploring a small local market. My parents navigated the accessible paths with ease. My children found treasures from their childhood memories, and the dog rested at my side, content. There was laughter, gentle teasing, and shared stories. There were no expectations to please everyone at once, no pressure to compromise endlessly. Instead, there was harmony, a delicate balance between individual freedom and collective enjoyment. That evening, as we sat around the fire pit at the Airbnb, roasting marshmallows and recounting the highlights of the day, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. not just for the success of the vacation itself, but for the lessons embedded in the struggle, the courage to assert boundaries, the power of empathy, and the understanding that love is most authentic when honesty is present. The dog lay curled up at my feet, tired but happy. My children leaned against me, excitedly recounting their favorite moments. My parents, though quieter, were engaged, sharing observations and smiles that felt earned and sincere. It was not a perfect family dynamic. No family is, but it was real, balanced, and full of connection. In that moment, I understood something essential. True family harmony is not about always accommodating everyone or avoiding conflict. It is about communication, mutual respect, and the courage to honor both others and oneself. By embracing this principle, we had transformed what could have been a disastrous trip into a meaningful experience of growth, understanding, and love. As night fell, stars scattered across the sky, I felt a sense of completion. The lessons of the past, the frustration, the exhaustion, the confrontation had culminated in a moment of clarity and harmony. I had reclaimed my own joy without diminishing theirs. Boundaries had been respected, needs had been acknowledged, and for the first time in years, I truly felt that the vacation and the family itself was a space where everyone could coexist with dignity, happiness, and love. The last morning of our redesigned vacation dawned with a gentle calm. The sun streamed through the windows, casting soft light across the room. My parents were quietly sipping coffee, my children laughing over a shared joke, and the dog lay sprawled comfortably on the rug, exhausted from the day's adventures. It was a stark contrast to the chaos and tension of our previous trip. As I packed our belongings, I reflected on the journey, the frustrations, the confrontations, the lessons learned, and the breakthroughs. The vacation had been more than a simple escape. It had been a crucible, forging understanding, patience, and clarity in the heat of familial tension. I thought back to the hike I had so longed to take, the freedom I had almost lost, and the boundaries I had to assert to reclaim it. That moment, walking the trail with my dog, had been symbolic, a reminder that my needs mattered, that my happiness was valid, and that asserting boundaries did not diminish. Love it strengthened it. I gathered my parents and children together, taking a quiet moment to speak from the heart. This trip wasn't perfect, I began, and it won't always be. But it taught us something important. Love isn't just sacrifice, and family isn't just compromise. It's about listening, understanding, and respecting each other's needs. My mother nodded, a faint smile on her lips, and my father's stern gaze softened as he added, "We may not like every boundary, but we understand them, and we see how much effort you've put into balancing everyone's needs." The children, sensing the gravity of the moment, hugged me tightly. Even the dog wagged his tail energetically, as if he, too, understood the significance of what had unfolded. As we loaded the car for the journey home, I felt a sense of closure. The previous vacation had been a storm, a test of endurance and patience. But this one had been a triumph, not in spite of the challenges, but because of how we faced them honestly, empathetically, and courageously, driving away. I realized the profound lessons this trip had imparted. Boundaries are not selfish. They are essential for maintaining balance, self-respect, and healthy relationships. Communication is the cornerstone of understanding. Honest dialogue, even when difficult, fosters empathy and connection. Love requires courage. Sometimes it means asserting your own needs, even in the face of resistance or disappointment. Compromise must be mutual. True harmony comes when all parties feel respected and valued, not just accommodated. Resilience grows through challenges. Conflict and frustration are not signs of failure. They are opportunities for growth and insight. By the time we reached home, the air in the car was light, filled with laughter, playful teasing, and quiet gratitude. The dog leapt happily from his seat, and my children ran ahead, excited to share their stories with the rest of the family. My parents followed, slower but content. A subtle understanding between us all that the journey had strengthened our bonds in ways words could barely capture. As I watched them, I realized something. Vacations, family, and love are never about perfection. They are about balance, empathy, courage, and the willingness to face discomfort in order to grow. And in this understanding, I found not just relief or satisfaction, but a deep, abiding sense of fulfillment. The trip had ended, but the lessons would stay with me forever. I had learned to honor my own joy without diminishing theirs, to confront conflict with compassion, and to embrace the complexity of family life. And in that realization, I understood something essential. Love, patience, and boundaries are not mutually exclusive, are the foundation for a life rich in connection, respect, and shared happiness. As the sun set behind the horizon, I looked at my family, the dog resting peacefully by my side, and felt a profound sense of peace. We had survived, we had grown, and we had discovered that even amidst the challenges, love could thrive, stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before.